Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader, and today we are ranking 19 Stephen King books. So recently I finished reading From a Buick 8, which is my 19th Stephen King book, and if you've read the Dark Tower series by him, then you know that 19 is a very important number in the Stephen King multiverse. So now that I've read 19 Stephen King books, I thought, okay, now we can rank them. And of course, I know that there are a lot more than 19 Stephen King books. There are over 60 books. So I have not even read a third of Stephen King books. But still, I thought it would be interesting to look back at the Stephen King books I've read in the past few years and rank them from worst to best. And before I get started, I want to mention one quick thing. You're gonna notice that a lot of the lower ranked books are Dark Tower books. And none of these books that I'm ranking here I actively dislike. The Dark Tower series is for me a decent book series, so I don't love them, but I kind of enjoy them, and I do appreciate the Stephen King multiverse. Having said that, let's get into the ranking. Coming in at number 19 is the first Dark Tower book, The Gunslinger. So this is by far the Stephen King book I least liked. So I do like the first section of this book where you have the shootout between the gunslinger and some weird zombie guys. But otherwise in this book you have the gunslinger just meandering along, and parts of the story are interesting, but there are also a bunch of boring parts. So this is the only Stephen King book that for me is a 6 out of 10. And all other Stephen King books I've read so far are at least a 7. And this was one of the first Stephen King books I ever read, so maybe I didn't get it that much since this is part of the wider Stephen King multiverse. But still I didn't enjoy it that much. And there's kind of a consensus online on Stephen King BookTube that, yeah, the Dark Tower series, it's great, but you have to push yourself through this first one. And apparently this book makes more sense once you've read the Dark Tower series, so who knows. Coming in at number 18 is the Dark Tower 4, Wizard and Glass. So one of the things that annoys me with the Dark Tower series is that it just takes forever to get going. Most of this book, although it's volume 4 of the Dark Tower series, it's almost a prequel, because you get the backstory of the gunslinger, Roland, and his love life. And the backstory isn't that bad necessarily, it's decent, but it's just too much. I mean, this is a very thick book, it's 800 pages, and what, 600 or 700 of those pages is the backstory. When I read a book, I don't want 3/4 of the book to be a backstory. There's one Stephen King book where that kind of works, but this is the middle volume of the Dark Tower series. And the only journey development to the Dark Tower you get in this book is in the beginning and the end. And those parts are good and interesting. So it's not a bad Stephen King book. The backstory is not bad, it's just a bit annoying when you want to get on with the series. And then the prequel is the middle book. I mean, he could have written a prequel as a separate book instead of putting it in the middle book. And also the backstory in this book sometimes is a bit too slow, especially in the beginning. Moving on to number 17 is the Dark Tower 6, Song of Susanna. There's a bunch of things I like with this book, but sometimes it's a bit too slow and it just goes on and on different characters. There's a bunch of cool action stuff in this book with gangsters, and the villains in this book are pretty good. And I appreciate the time traveling stuff, but some of the stuff with Susanna and Mia towards the beginning of the book, it just goes on, and it's not that gripping of a story. So while I did enjoy this book generally, there were some pacing issues for me, especially in the first 100 pages of this book. By the way, the Stephen books that are ranked here from 18 up to 16 are for me 7 out of 10s. So it's not a bad book, but it's far from Stephen King's best Dark Tower book. Next up is the Dark Tower 2, The Drawing of the Tree. So this is really a mixed bag. I love the Eddie section of this story, with the drugs and the gangsters and the drug shootout. That I loved, and the guy getting rid of the drugs in the plane and the cops interview. All of that is fun and great. The serial killer story with Jack Mort, it's a decent story. It's decently fun to read. But then the story in this book of Susanna or Odetta Holmes was a bit boring to read. There were some interesting elements, but in general I didn't enjoy it. Overall, this book, it did convince me to continue to read the Dark Tower series, but it also shows the trend in the Dark Tower series of having some iffy pacings, which is a problem with some Stephen King books in general. Now, from books ranked 15 all the way up to 10, these are 8 out of 10s for me. First up, we have It, which has a lot of amazing horror scenes, but you can see this book is a brick. This edition is almost 1400 pages, and this is Stephen King's most bloated book. I sincerely believe that if you cut out maybe 300 pages of this book, it would be a much better paced story. So some of the interludes with Mike Hanlon I kind of found boring. So although I do love the character of Dick Halloran from The Shining, his appearance in it is kind of random, and the firing scene, I didn't like that much. But the clown scenes are great. The horror is great in this book. So this is a high-end mixed bag for me, as there are a lot of things in this book that should have been cut out, I believe, but there are several Stephen King scenes here that are perfect horror. Although the ending is not that good. The ending is just weird. The last 100 pages, how it's paced, it's not well paced. But apart from the ending and some of the digressions in this book, it's a great story, and I do appreciate the characters where you get different point of views from them. I would say my favorite part of this book is part 2, June of 1958, where you get introduced to the Losers Club as kids. All of their stories are great, and the opening chapter of this book is amazing, where you get the introduction of It the Clown and how it kills Georgie. So yeah, a good book with some flaws. So coming in at number 14 is The Dark Tower 5, Wolves of the Calla. So I've only read 6 Dark Tower books so far, and up to now this is the second to best one in my opinion. And for the most part I love reading about the backstory of Father Callahan, which was one of the characters in Salem's Lot. And there's a long build up to the showdown between the wolf killers and the good guys. And it takes a while, but I like the showdown, although it's quite short. Some of the book is a little slow sometimes, but otherwise it's a good Dark Tower novel. Even though it's a big Stephen King book, about 750 pages, it doesn't feel too long as a book like It or Wizard and Glass. Coming in at number 13 is Doctor Sleep, which is the sequel to The Shining, and it's a good sequel, but it's not perfect. It's nothing compared to The Shining, which I'll be talking about later, but still the villains are decent, and you do get to see how it is to be a recovering alcoholic, as unfortunately the trope here of like father like son you get to see with Danny. And you can say that this book is not as dark as the movie was, Doctor Sleep, but it's still a good Stephen King horror fantasy story with these guys who just travel in these vans, who kidnap and kill kids, and I appreciated the happy ending in this book. So another good Stephen King book. Next up at number 12 is a Stephen King book I recently finished, From a Buick 8. So a lot of this book is just a retelling backstory, but this is a fantasy horror novel that reminds me a lot of The Mist, because you have this magical car thing that some cops keep in the shed, and it does some weird stuff, and some of the creatures that are spawned really remind me of the creatures in The Mist. So From a Buick 8 somehow, although I don't understand it, must be connected to the Dark Tower Stephen King multiverse, and I love that aspect of the story. And the grief of the son losing his cop father, that's also a good story, and I appreciated a lot of the stories that the policeman told. It's far from a perfect Stephen King book, but it's a good standalone that's loosely connected to the wider Stephen King multiverse. Coming in at number 11 is this behemoth, The Stand by Stephen King. It might be his biggest novel. I think it's slightly bigger than it. This is the extended edition. And some people hate the middle part. They think the shorter version of The Stand was better. I haven't read the shorter version of The Stand, but I don't think it's that's too long. Sure, he digresses a bit too much from time to time, Stephen King, but overall it's a good book. So I love the first part of this book. The first part is great with the pandemic stuff and society falling into anarchy and soldiers just shooting civilians willy-nilly. That was awesome to read about. And then the middle part where they restart civilization and establish their own government, that was also quite good in my opinion. That political aspect of the book I did enjoy. Some of it was a bit too much, but overall it was a good balance. The part I least like about this book is the ending, which wasn't good. Let's just say that. So the build up to the ending was decent, but then the ending itself is it's just dumb. I mean, you have this showdown, and then you have God that shows up and kills everyone. What was the point? Several of the main characters are just killed off like that for nothing. nothing. What's the stakes if God just changes everything at the end? But overall, this is a good story. And this is a prequel, in a sense, to one of the aspects of the Dark Tower that you read about in the 4th Dark Tower volume. You also have the villain Randall Flagg, who appears in this novel, which is a pretty good Stephen King villain in my opinion. So I certainly preferred The Stand to it. Coming in at number 10 now, the middle point of the ranking, we have The Dark Tower 3, The Wastelands, my favorite Dark Tower book so far. This happens to be one of the volumes where the story advances most. So basically the first half of the book is bringing back this kid Jake back from the dead through another dimension, and then the second half of the book you have the journey itself. So sure, the journey doesn't really begin until the half point of this book, but it's fine. The first half was still interesting, and the second half you have the journey that develops with Charlie, the choo-choo train at the end. I like the TikTok man and the criminals that Roland has a showdown with at the end, and then you have some weird mystery guy who shows up at the end and saves the TikTok man, which I liked. The only bad thing with this book is that it ends on a cliffhanger. So yeah, I enjoyed the psychotic train, Charlie the choo-choo train. However, the only bad thing with that is that it ends on a cliffhanger. Will our heroes die in this train or will they not? Which is finished in the 4th Dark Tower volume in its first 100 pages. So that's the only reason why it's not ranked any higher. So now from books number 9 down to number 3, they're all 9s out of 10 in my opinion. So you can see I highly regard Stephen King books. They're usually at least good, often they're great. And coming in at number 9 is Salem's Lot. Now there's some really great horror in this. There's some creepy stuff with vampires, some sucking sounds. They're basically wiping a whole town out slowly but surely, with them almost killing everyone by the end. I have a few pacing issues with this book, especially in the first 100 pages where Stephen King introduces the community of Jerusalem's Lot, but he just goes from one character to another to another to another, so that's just too much. You don't spend that much time with any of the characters in the first 100 pages. He names a bunch of characters and then later they're killed off. They could have been just killed off without that character development that was just weak. But I love the vampires in this book. The characters are pretty good. Most of their deaths are meaningful except Gordon. That's just weird how he dies. Kind of anticlimactic how it was written. I don't like the beginning of this book because the beginning of this book takes place chronologically at the end of the book, which is just confusing. So if I reread this book, the beginning would be less confusing, but overall a great Stephen King horror novel. Coming in at number 8 is 11/22/63, which is a story where a teacher travels back in time to save Jack Kennedy from being whacked by Lee Harvey Oswald. And this book without a doubt proves there's no conspiracy that killed Kennedy. It was just some crazy communist who did so. And I appreciated this novel overall. The pacing is good throughout the book. It's just the last 100 pages, it's alternate history, but it just goes crazy. And I understand this is a Stephen King book, so there's fantasy and multiverse elements with the worlds going crazy with nuclear disaster and whatnot. But still, I didn't love the ending that much. The story overall was meaningful. It's just what happened after Kennedy was saved. It's interesting when you read it at first, but I'm an alternate history nerd. I love alternate history. And I think, no, there's no way. No, this alternate history thing. No, this thing wouldn't have happened. This is not plausible at all. I understand this is some fantasy stuff, so it's not supposed to be plausible like sci-fi, but still, I didn't like that element that much. Although it was interesting at times. But overall, a great thrill ride by Stephen King, 11/22/63. And also, if you like historical fiction, this takes place in the late 50s and early 60s, so there's that aspect also that's quite good. Coming in at number 7 is Billy Summers, one of Stephen King's most recent books, written in 2021. And this is a story of an assassin hired to do one last job of killing someone, and he pretends to be dumb, but he's actually quite smart. And you have gangsters in this book, which I love as a Stephen King trope. So he does his job in this book, but then he fears that they're gonna cross him, and they do try to do so, but they fail, so he escapes. But he also saves the life of a raped girl in this book. You get him getting revenge for her in this novel, so that's also gripping. And I like the kind of fatherly daughter dynamic in this book between Billy Summers and that girl. The last 100 pages of this book are great, with Billy Summers showing up to the gangster's house, killing everyone except the boss and making a deal with the boss. And after he goes to the bigger billionaire boss, and that billionaire was a sicko, so that was satisfying to read his demise. And the ending for Billy Summers himself is kind of tragic, but it works in this great story. And also in this book you have some nods towards The Shining in this book, as they see what was the Overlook Hotel before, and there are some more paintings, and I appreciated that fantasy horror element of this book. Next up on the list is the only non-fiction book here. It is On Writing by Stephen King. So the first half of this book is a memoir. It's interesting to learn about Stephen King's life, as Stephen King is my third favorite author, so of course I appreciate learning about his sad childhood kind of, and then how he became a writer. And you also get the stories behind how he wrote some of the novels. So you learn about Carrie and some other novels that he's written. You also learn about him becoming clean, no longer doing drugs or alcohol. And you also learn about his near-fatal car crash and how he recovered and continued to write. And also the second half of this book is great writing advice. And I've tried to write fiction. I'm not good at it, but still it's good writing advice for fiction. Coming in at number 5 is Pet Sematary. And this is ranked high, but my god, what's it? This was just a screwed up read. It's a great novel. It's a well-paced novel overall, but it's just a depressing read. If you've ever lost someone, apparently this is even worse as a read, but the grief you feel throughout this book of losing a pet or losing a child, it's screwed up. You also have some really creepy horror elements in this book. The last line of this book makes you shiver. The last line of the book is really creepy. So not only is it a great Stephen King horror novel, it's also really disturbing. And it will take a while before I ever read this again, probably, because you feel really low when you read this book. But it's a great Stephen King story, so everyone should maybe read it once. But it hits different from other Stephen King books. Other Stephen King books are quite fun, even though you have horror. This is not a fun read, even though it's a great novel. Coming in at number 4, we have Insomnia. Now this book, I love the Dark Tower connections, and you get some more explanation of the Dark Tower universe and the different levels of the Dark Tower and how it works. And then you have the good and bad little angels in this book. And it's a long book, it's almost 700 pages, but I loved it. And it's a slow story for the most part, but I appreciated it. You follow an old guy who's dealing with grief, and he finds another woman who's dealing with grief, and they deal with that together. There's also an abusive husband in this book, with the wife and child trying to get away. The abortion stuff, however you fall on the issue, is a bit annoying throughout this book. It's a bit preachy maybe, but overall a great novel. You get a cameo of Mike Hanlon from It. That was well done in this book. And of course the Dark Tower elements are great in this novel. You get to see a scene in this book where one of the children of the old woman in this book and their spouse come along and try to get her to sell her house, which is horrible. I love this book. It's almost a 10 for me. Almost, but not quite. And there are some horror elements in this book, but this is just great Stephen King fantasy in my opinion. Another reason it's a great book is that it's a great addition to the Dark Tower Stephen King multiverse universe. Coming in at number 3 is a novella that's not technically a Stephen King book in a sense, but I read it, so I'm including it anyway, and I read it separately as a novella, and that's The Mist. Now the creatures in The Mist are amazing, and you get to see how society collapses when you have a disaster and humans turning on each other. That's also nice, but what I really love about this book is the things that happen in The Mist itself. So it's a quick short read, but it's one of the best stories that Stephen King has ever written. Although once again the ending of this story is not as dark as the movie. Coming in at number 2, now we're moving into the top tier books, so these are both 10s in my opinion. And number 2 is Misery for me. It's an almost perfect book. The only thing I dislike with this book is when you see Paul Sheldon's story that he's writing. So the writing process, how it's explained, that's just amazing. If you read one Stephen King fiction book to understand better how to be a good writer, then this is the best one, Misery. You got a bunch of interesting, possibly useful writing advice in this book. The story itself of Paul Sheldon I didn't really enjoy, that was boring, but otherwise it's a perfect book. The horror, the tension, it's so well built up. Annie Wilkes is a horrible woman, but she's a great character in this book. The pacing is almost perfect, and the violence is brutal, but well written. I love almost everything about this book, the ending, the opening, the story itself overall. This is the first Stephen King standalone that I've read in a sense as a novel. Now we're coming to the top spot, and that is of course The Shining. The only book that I've ever read that I consider perfect is The Shining by Stephen King. It's one of his first books. So far of all the books I've read by him, it's also his best by far. There's not one word wasted on any of these pages. From the first sentence I knew I would love this book. It's weird. It deals with a serious subject, a recovering alcoholic, and going to a hotel with his family and him going insane slowly because of the voices he hears, because of the magical power. But I just love the story. The craziness of Jack Torrance for me was kind of fun. The backstory of him as a teacher and how he got fired because he attacked a student, that was also a great scene. All the characters are well developed in this book. Even the minor ones are great. There's one really great horror scene. So a lot of the horror in this, it's not scary, it's just cool. But the scene with the purple lady, that's really creepy and scary. It's not the scariest Stephen King book I've read, but it's the most scary scene that I've ever read. The room 217 scene, oh my god. But I had a blast reading this book with the Torrance family in the Overlook Hotel. So if you were to ask me, what's the best thing Stephen King has ever written? I might reply, you know, in my opinion, of all those fiction books I've read so far, the best novel overall is The Shining by Stephen King. Written way back in the 70s. Only his third novel published. So that was my ranking of 19 Stephen King books. I've gone through a lot of books now, and that's not even 1/3 of them. So who knows, in the future I may make another video of some other Stephen King books I've read. And I love Stephen King as an author. There's so much to talk about. He's developed such an expansive multiverse that's so fascinating in how books are connected in one way or another. So yeah, love talking about Stephen King. And if you enjoyed the ranking of these Stephen King books, then maybe you'll enjoy this playlist of some of the books there that I've reviewed on this channel. Anyways, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.